bunch of people who have logged on, and it's just 4 o'clock. So welcome everyone to a Friends from the Field webinar. This one is about the pink lady slipper, ecology and conservation, and we're so excited to have Peter Curtis here with us today to share his learning with us. If you would like to introduce yourself in our chat box, feel free to do so. Share your name, where you're living, and maybe something about why you decided to join this webinar today. Maybe you have a lady slipper story you want to share in the chat box. I'm going to pass it over to Jake to do a little bit of technology housekeeping, and then I will introduce Peter and we'll be on our way.
Hi everyone, it's Jake from IHT. There's a couple of features we just want to point out to you for easy use. Like Lander mentioned, you can leave us a chat, let us know where you're from, where you're tuning in from. We'd always like to know. Feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. We will save a segment of time for questions with Peter at the end. So, you know, if you can hold your question until the end, great. But if you just are too excited and need to put it out there, drop it in the chat box. That's fantastic. I think below your screens, you'll also see the raise your hand feature, which Lander will help you use at the end if you so choose. We'll save that for the question portion after Peter has done presenting. And that will allow you the option of asking Peter your question directly via audio, or you can use your video feature as well if you so choose. And with that, I think I'll hand it back over to Lander.
Thanks, Jake. I think I forgot to say that my name's Lander and I am from Blue Hill Heritage Trust, and this is a collaboration between Blue Heritage Trust and Island Heritage Trust. So thank you for introducing yourself, Jake.
I forgot something too, actually, so I'm going to interrupt you again. And so we had our highest registration rate for participants. So technically we can host live 100 people. So in the event that you get for some reason bumped off, or you tune in just a little bit late and you're unable to log in, just wait, you know, unfortunately you'll have to wait just like 2 or 3 days and we'll get the recording up and sent to you and on your way. So you can view the webinar then. And Lander, I'm so sorry for interrupting you, but I wanted to say that before I forgot, and I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much for doing that, Jake. That was an important piece. Okay, so I'm super excited to introduce Peter Curtis, Professor Emeritus of Forest Ecology at Ohio State University and longtime resident of Brooksville. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much, Lander. It's great to be here. Thank you, Jake. And I'm just going to see if we can get this technology to work right. So share my screen, and we can get right to the PowerPoint. Up, and it's working. So everybody, I hope, can see that well. And so, yeah, I'm so excited. Thank you for having me be part of the Friends from the Field webinar. I'm excited to talk about an interest of mine, the pollination ecology and conservation of lady slipper orchids. Cypripedium acoli is the scientific name. They are masters of deception, so you will hear a little bit about that. As Lander mentioned, I'm a newly retired professor of ecology from at Ohio State University. You can see my email address there, so if we don't get to your questions by the end of this, I hope to have time for that. Feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to chat about lady slippers or anything else botanical. So let's roll along. So that's where we are. Just a little bit about my background. I am an ecologist. I've done a lot of different things in ecology over the years, but for the last couple of decades, I and my group have focused on forests, and particularly on the impacts of climate change and aging in forests on carbon storage in the upper Great Lakes. A lot of my research has been done as what we call the tip of the mitt, the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. And these are just some pictures of how we do our work with towers and instruments on the above the canopy, in the canopy, below the canopy, all to create diagrams like you see there on carbon storage, what's coming in, what's going out, and so forth, and how that's affected by these different processes. So that's my specialty, if you will. And I have to say, sort of full disclosure, I'm not an orchidist. Those are people who really focus on orchids in their research or their passion. I love orchids, but I don't claim to be an orchidist. However, I am a botanist. I have a degree in botany from a reputable institution. And as Lander mentioned, I'm a long-term, in fact, really a lifelong summer resident of Brooksville. My grandparents moved here in the 30s. And my father and his brother and sister grew up in Brooksville, and we just can't keep away. So we have kept coming back for me my whole life. So that's a little bit of my background, my bona fide, if you will. And let's see where we're going to go. What we have planned for today. So I like to have a little bit of a roadmap for what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm a botanist, so we're going to get a little bit of botany. I'm going to put the pink lady slippers within sort of context, botanical context. Where do they fit in the angiosperm tree of life? Then we're going to talk about some particulars of orchids and their pollination, rewards and deceptions. So orchids are really pretty amazing in that regard. Then we're going to talk about how you might help them out a little bit, hand pollination. And so we're going to have a tutorial on how to hand pollinate this particular species, Cypripedium macaulay, the pink lady slipper. From there, once we get the pollination and we've got some seeds produced, what happens? And so I'm going to talk about the next phase of their life cycle, the dust seeds. They're also an amazing story for orchids, and in this orchid in specific, and something we call mycoheterotrophy, the very intimate relationships between these orchids and fungi. And lastly, try to wrap up with some thoughts about conservation issues of this species and going forward. So that's where we're going to go. Hopefully get to all that and with time for questions. So the flowering plant tree of life, the angiosperms. Now I have to say I got this idea from listening to Hannah's talk on seaweeds a couple of weeks ago, where she emphasized on a couple of occasions algae are not plants. Well, we're in the plant kingdom now. This is the flowering plants. And you look down here, we have the origins of seeds. Of course, gymnosperms, conifers are not flowering plants, but they are seeds. We get up here to flowering plants. And so some of you, I think many of you will be aware that the flowering plants, the angiosperms, are divided into a number of big groups. The biggest of those are the so-called true dicots up here. So there's dicots, and there may be 3/4 of the 300,000 species or so of angiosperms, so a lot of species. The biggest of the genera, or rather the biggest of the families, I'm sorry, in the dicots are the asters, the sunflower family, with about 32,000 species, depending on who's counting. But the other big group, and the one that's going to concern us, are the monocots. And there's about maybe 20% of the species, 60,000 species or so. And within those, so we're talking about monocots here, that's where the orchids sit. And orchids are the second largest of the plant family. So the Orchidaceae, the orchid family, maybe 28,000 species. Again, it depends a bit on who's doing the counting and the dividing. So you got monocots and dicots. Orchids are in the dicot group. And so we're going to continue with a little bit of this theme about where they sit, because I love this part of botany, even though I'm not a taxonomist. And I really love this particular tree of life because it has all these economically and edible plants. So this is just the monocots. So we're just looking at where the monocots are. And you recall there's the grasses here, for example, actually fairly closely related to the bromeliads, which pineapple is one. Over here we've got bananas and ginger. That's one group. But right here in the middle is where the orchids are. And I'll see if we can get that circled there. There's the orchids, actually being exemplified by the vanilla orchid. So that's actually one of the few orchids that we use now for edible reasons, purposes outside of just horticulture and the beauty of orchids, is vanilla orchid. And they're a little bit closely related to onions and the other group species and families within the amaryllis subgroup here. So that's the monocot tree of life, and this is where orchids sit within that. Again, it's a big family. That's the family of orchids. So we'll just sort of continue on with that. Now, so we're just drilling down here to give you a better idea of where our particular species sits within this whole big group of plants. So the orchid family, as I said, maybe 28,000 species. I like this tree of life because it's sort of simple, this tree for the orchids. We've got higher orchids up here. This is most of them, and the big showy ones, which we're familiar with from horticulture, with a couple of genera, the genus, one genus, two genera, like Epidendrum and Dendrobium, huge genera with over 1,000 species. So these are really big, almost all in the tropics. But down here, we've got smaller these are subfamilies actually, including the slipper orchids, the Cypripidioidea, as we say in botany. And that's where they sort of sit within the orchid family. And this is a considerably smaller than when we look up here. There's only 160 species of these slipper orchids within the subfamily, within 5 distinct genera. It's all getting kind of technical, but you got to bear with me. This is botany. And this is the way these 5 genera are distributed. So the slipper orchids are widely distributed, not in Africa, but you can see they're in tropical Asia and South America. And the genus that we're going to be focusing on, Cypripedium, is this one here. And you can see it's the most widespread of all the slipper orchids, these 5 genera. And it's widespread in North America and across Eurasia. So it's a successful genus of orchids, although compared to some of these other ones, Epidendrum, not so much. But that's where we are. So now we're going to look at, so we're into slipper orchids now, Cypripedium. And just finally, as we're getting close to our star, I love this website. This is the U.S. Forest Service, has a nice website called Meet the Ladies, the Lady Slipper Orchids. And there are about 58 species of Cypripedium, of these lady slipper orchids, 15 of which are found in North America. And if you're lucky, you've seen some of these in addition to the pink lady slipper, like the yellow lady slipper down here, or the showy lady slipper. Some of these are quite rare. But that's not the case for the star of our show, the pink lady slipper. So we're now finally get down to the one that we're really going to focus on, and that's the pink lady slipper orchid, Cypripedium macaulay. And this species is quite widespread. And we're going to talk about its habitat requirements in a minute, but you can see from this distribution map down here below, it's found from Newfoundland and Labrador all the way down to Georgia, across the Appalachians, sweeping across the Great Lakes, and then sort of following the boreal forest up through central Canada. There's even a weird disjunct population up here in the Northwest Territories, which I have no idea what it's doing up there, but it's widely distributed across this part of eastern North America, this particular species. Other Cypripedium species have different distributions throughout North America, some in the West and some co-occurring here as well. So that's our star, the pink lady slipper orchid, and that's where it grows. And many of you, I hope, and Jake has just told me that he saw for the first time, it probably looked something like this, sitting out there being beautiful in the understory and along a forest path. Okay, so orchids are amazing and for lots of reasons, but of course they attract us for the beauty of their display, of their flowers. And as botanists, we recognize that these flowers are highly modified. They're amazing, but they have all the same parts as regular flowers. So, and that's will sort of be important as we talk about their pollination. So they've got petals, and they've got sepals on the outside, and they've got the male parts, the stamens, and they got the female parts, the pistils. And this illustration just sort of makes that point where there's a general monocot flower, in this case hypoxis, which sort of sits next to the orchids. Some of you may be familiar with this particular plant, the yellow starflower. So that's actually grows, one of the hypoxis species grows around here. And here's a general orchid flower, just kind of showing, yes, there are petals. That lower petal that's highly modified often is referred to as the lip. And we're going to see that prominently in of course, our lady slipper. That's the slipper part of this modified petal. Oops. But it's also important to know that the reproductive parts, the stamen and the pistil, the male parts and the female parts, have been fused in orchids into something we call the column. And so they're not usually separated as they are in many other plants and many other flowers. But they're still there. They've got anthers, they've got pollen, and they've got a stigma, and they've got ovaries and all those sort of normal parts, even though they're highly modified, and in some cases in really bizarre ways, as we'll see in a bit. So that's kind of the background, a little bit background botany. So let's now take a close look at the pink lady slipper. And this is going to orient us to when we think more about pollination and its amazing habits in pollination. So over here is just a sketch, a nice line drawing of the lady slipper. And this is one of my, just shot with my phone, one of the orchids in our neighborhood. And what I want to point out are a couple things. So right up here is the anther, that little nubbin that's sticking out there, and the one that's a little bit more exaggerated here. So that's got the pollen. And in orchids, we refer to these as pollinia, because the pollen has been packaged into a little packet that in this case is quite sticky. And you're going to see why that's important in a second, but they're not individual pollen grains that blow around. It's a package. Other groups of plants do this, but it's really highly developed in the orchids, these pollinia. They're not individual pollen grains. It's very specialized for being moved by some sort of a vector, usually insects, but sometimes birds. So we have the pollinia, and then just sort of technical, here, there's something we call the staminode, and this little piece of tissue, which is actually, when we talk about modified flowers, this is actually a modified stamen. Normally in a monocot, there might be 3. There's 2 here. That's the last one that's been modified to this little flap. And this is important in the way it directs insects in pollination. And it's also important when we get to the hand pollination. So that's the staminode, covers the stigma. You can't actually see the stigma, the female part in this picture, but we'll get to that. And then lastly, we've got that highly modified lower petal called the lip. And I'm going to say, it's a trap. Don't go there. Or, well, we do want you to go there if you're a bumblebee. And you'll see how you will be deceived. But that's the lip. And it's also called a trap flower, a trap blossom, because it will temporarily trap bumblebees inside there, but we'll give away the story. So we've got the anthers and pollinia, we've got the staminode that covers the stigma, and we've got the lip, which is the trap of that flower. And the rest of it's just sort of ornamentation, other petals and sepals and so forth. Everybody with me? Okay. Okay, now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, and I love this illustration. I borrowed this from eSchool Today. I don't know if this for people who are stuck at home with their children, but your cool facts and tips on pollination, just so that we're all on top of what happens in pollination. So start over on the left and move around. So somehow that flower, any old flower, including an orchid, has to convince a pollinator to visit it. And so a pollinator visits to collect nectar. There typically has to be a reason for that insect or bird or bat or mouse to visit the flower, and they're usually after nectar, sometimes pollen, or some other things. And in the process, pollen somehow gets onto that pollinator's body someplace, and when it visits a separate flower, normally, sometimes it's the same flower, but the plant would like it to be a separate flower, even on a separate plant for outcrossing. When it moves to that separate plant, it brushes, in searching around for nectar, it will transfer some of that pollen from its body onto the stigma, the female part of the flower. And so that's pollination. Gets pollen from the anthers of one plant to the stigma of another, and the insect is looking for some reward. It's not there to just do the plant's bidding. It's looking for something like nectar. Okay, so that's pollen. That's as much as you need to know about pollination. And there are various contrivances that plants have undertaken, have evolved to get this done, are amazing, and nowhere more amazing than the orchids. Which brings me to the father of pollination ecology, which is, as in much of ecology and evolution, when we think about good ideas, it goes back to Darwin. And Darwin really was a botanist, actually. He doesn't get credit for that as much as he should. We think about him with finches and Galapagos, or maybe barnacles, but his real love were plants. He did a lot of seminal work, and he was particularly intrigued by orchids, and he really developed the field of pollination ecology, reproductive ecology. So his book in 1862 on the various contrivances by which British and foreign orchids are fertilized by insects and the good effects of intercrossing. Nothing like this has ever been published before, and he really set the stage for thinking about these interactions between pollinators and their flowers and the coevolution of those two, of that system. So we have to really acknowledge Darwin's contribution to this whole field and the fact that he really started it. So one of the things that Darwin started to think about and was amazed by and was how that very important step of attracting the pollinators. How do orchids actually do this? Well, most of them are legitimate, if you will, in the way they do this, by providing a reward. And so maybe 70% of orchids will provide some reward to the insect or the bird that will visit their flowers. Mostly it's insects. And in many cases, that reward is nectar. And so there are often specialized spurs, parts of the flowers that hold the nectaries. And so insects with proboscis or beaks on birds of particular length will be seeking nectar and be pollinating those plants. So nectar is a common reward in orchids. There's a variety of orchids, particularly tropical American orchids, which attract so-called orchid bees, the euglossine bees. And this is a particular kind of reward, these oils, fragrant oils that these bees will use in their own mating. So the male bees will collect oils from orchids and use them to attract females of that same species in their own mating. And these are often highly specific relationships between one species of orchid and one species of orchid bee. And so amazing coevolution. But again, it's a reward. So the orchids are producing these oils or sometimes waxes and resins specifically for those pollinators. So that's one section of orchids, most of them, but quite a few don't do that. They are pollinated by what we call deception. So they've decided, for whatever they've evolved, to not provide any sort of reward for the pollinator. And so they may deceive the pollinator by what we call food deception, and the lady slipper is one of those, which looks like it ought to provide nectar or something in there. It has nectar guides that stimulate a bee to think that there might be something there. It might mimic another plant that does produce nectar. And so, but there's nothing there. So the pollinator will visit and find nothing. Doesn't seem like a great strategy. And you'll see perhaps why it might not be in some cases. But this is pollination by food deception. The particularly bizarre example of deception here is something we call sexual deceit. And I won't have too much to say about this, but it really is incredible. And it's most highly developed in a group of Australian orchids in which the orchid mimics the form and scent of a female of species of wasps. And these can also be highly specific. So the male thinks that it's mating with the female when it goes and visits the flower. And that's its supposed reward. Of course, nothing's going to happen. It deposits sperm, but there's no insects are to come from that, but it gets dusted with, it picks up a pollinium and takes that to the next flower. So males aren't particularly choosy, these plants have found, but the mimics are often really remarkable. And in many cases, they also mimic the scent, the pheromones of the females. So that's sexual deceit. So they can attract them by providing a reward or by deception. And we're going to look at the one we're talking about, our favorite, the pink lady slipper, is a deceiver, a master of deception. So how does this actually work? Let's see how we're doing. Oh, not too bad. Okay, so how does the pink lady slipper actually do this deception pollination? Well, I've got a cutaway here, and I hope my animation works. This is actually not a pink lady slipper if you look carefully. This is probably one of the yellow lady slippers that's got a broader opening to the lip, but imagine that's a little bit more closed up like this. So the steps are these. So first, a queen bumblebee, and this is usually late May in this area, The bees are just emerging, these queens. It's a naive bee because it's never been to one of these flowers before. It's never been deceived yet. Bees are pretty clever, they learn. So it looks at this flower, thinks there's probably something there. So it enters the flower looking for nectar or pollen. She flies in and gets trapped in the lip there. She can get in, but it's sort of like a lobster trap. It closes behind her and she can't get out that way. So she looks around thinking she's going to find some nectar or pollen, finds nothing, but realizes that there's an escape route out the top here. She can see the light actually out this little escape route. And so she crawls out this, following this dotted line out the top. In the meanwhile, picking up, going by the sticky polinium, which sticks to her back. So she exits she exits via a snug little exit hole, just sized for bumblebees, carrying a polinium, but she's not naive anymore. She says, she's thinking, to the degree that bumblebees think, there was nothing there. Now, should I try this again? There may be someplace else. I'm gonna go pollinate some blueberries or something. But maybe I just got there after, too late. Somebody else, some other bee had been there and drunk all the nectar. So the plant is counting on her being deceived at least twice, because that's what's going to be required for pollination. I'll just continue my little animation. So now a non-naive bee comes along. She's carrying a polinium on her back. She goes into the hole, again finds nothing, crawls out the same way, but in the meantime deposits that sticky polinium, adheres to the stigma, and that's pollination. That's what has to happen. 2 deceptions by a queen bumblebee who has to go in and come out the right way and get a polinium, the pollen mass, and do it again. This doesn't sound like a great way of ensuring pollination. But, and this has been a great subject for evolutionary biologists to scratch their heads about and think about why this has evolved, and is it cheaper to forego possible pollination rather than making nectar, and so forth and so on. So lots of interesting arguments about why this is a viable strategy. But clearly it works some of the time. So as you're wandering around the woods, and now would be a good time to see this, because Jake, you saw an orchid a week ago, they're fading pretty quickly in this part of Maine right now. But if you look carefully, and there are enough of them, you'll see something that looks like this, and that's a fertilized orchid fruit, or developing fruit, a fertilized flower, and the flower is shriveling up, is dehiscing ahead of other plants which haven't been pollinated. So this plant's been pollinated, the ovules inside have been fertilized, and seeds are forming inside that individual. And if we also look carefully at larger populations, we'll see that's last year's capsule. So this plant, this is it, this year's flower, that's last year's capsule, which has shed its seeds. So the dust seeds, which we'll talk about in a second, have been shed from that plant. So you can see even last year's, in some cases the year before, and so you can actually see in many cases who has been successful this year, last year, and maybe even the year before. And I'll show you that in a second as well. So clearly the deception works at least some of the time. But what's been observed in lady slippers is that it often doesn't. In fact, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, none of these plants will get pollinated and produce seeds. So in most years, most plants don't even flower. And when you learn to recognize the non-flowering plants, the vegetative plants, you'll see there are lots more of them than there are the ones that produce flowers. And most of the ones that do produce flowers never get pollinated. So the fruit set is what we call fruit set, is very low, usually zero, often 0 to maybe 10% of all the flowers that are produced will actually make a fruit and then seeds. I'm going to show you one data slide. This is from a Professor Emeritus now, Doug Gill, who was at University of Maryland, who followed thousands of lady slippers for 20 years, from the 70s to the 90s, in a variety of populations, but this one was in Virginia. I just want to point out that, for example, in 1980, here, there were 1,000, at least 1,000 visible plants, that's including ones that weren't flowering. If we look down here, the ones that are flowering and fruiting, maybe of those 1,000, there were maybe 110 flowering, and not one of those 100 plants produced a fruit. And you can see very low numbers down here in terms of fruit production. And now he did see a big increase in flower production and also apparently the number of plants right around 1990. And then just to get ahead of myself a little bit, the reason for that, or he thinks, or this was at least coincident with defoliation by gypsy moths in this area. So the canopy was opened up. There's a lot more sunlight reaching these plants during this gypsy moth infestation. So that may come back. So, but the point here is that while deception works some of the time, for most flowers in most individuals, they don't produce in any given year. Very low, notoriously low flowering and fruit, and even more so for fruit set. Okay, let's see. We're pretty much on schedule. So turns out, however, if you're interested in helping this out, perhaps increasing seed production in a local population on your own land or someplace or somebody you know, it's surprisingly easy to hand pollinate this orchid and to increase fruit set and seed production. And basically, as I'm saying here, the tools of the trade is a toothpick. You can do this with a toothpick. I also use a headband magnifier like jewelers wear, and you can get them on Amazon for like $15 because my eyes aren't that great. If you've got good young eyes, you probably can do this without any kind of magnifier, but it's a little bit easier if you have a magnifier. So what do? And I also have a little video, hopefully this will work, if you were interested in hand pollinating these plants. And it's kind of fun anyway. So I'm gonna move my images around here. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do, and this is what you have to get comfortable doing, is you've got to gently remove that staminode, because that makes it, you can't see the stigma, you really can't get to the pollinia with that in the way. So, and I'll show you how this is done, but basically you just take your toothpick and you break it off gently, doesn't hurt the flower, and you're exposing the stigma right there, and it's easier to get to the anthers. So you gently remove the staminode. Then take your toothpick and you remove that sticky pollinium with your toothpick, so it looks like that. And it takes a little bit of practice, but it's not that difficult. And they are kind of sticky, so they want to be connected to a bee's back, and you're trying to sort of mimic that. You take that and you buzz it over to a different plant, and you glom it onto the stigma. You just press it up into the stigma of that plant, of a different plant, for outcrossing, and that's it. And then I'm saying here, you let nature take over, and this is a fluorescence image through a microscope of orchid pollen grains germinating, and there are thousands of them, tens of thousands of them would germinate on that stigma and grow down and fertilize all the little ovules, the thousands of ovules which are in the ovary of this plant. So that's the way it's done. But let me show you a video of me doing this with some orchids on our land here in Brooksville. Because there's so few of them, they never set fruit, and I would like to have more. So the idea here is by pollinating the plants and having their seeds go out, I hope to get more plants in our woods. I'm very jealous of people who have lots of orchids, that we just have a few, and there's so few that they never get visited. They don't deceive the pollinators well enough. So let's see if this works. Is this coming across to everybody? Okay, let's see how I'm doing it here and convince you that, now it's a little late in the season for this now, but let's look at this. Can you hear the audio? No, wait.
It took me a while to figure this out.
That's removing the staminode.
I had to convince myself over the course of a year. See how that looks? That's the sticky part that would stick onto a bee.
There's about 600,000 mosquitoes for
Color-coded toothpicks down here so I can remember which plant I'm taking pollen from and which plant pollen is going to. It's not that complicated, but so I've taken the pollen, that's the blue plant, and I'm going to pollinate it with pollen from a yellow toothpick. As you'll see, that came from a different plant. So this is the transferring the pollen to the stigma part of this whole process.
So you're pollinating blue one with yellow.
Oh, yep, exactly. And it just said, wow, that's awesome.
Done.
Okay. And you have to be gentle with the flowers, but they're actually really pretty robust. But it takes a little bit of practice, but it's not that difficult. And what's I suppose gratifying or impressive is, oops, let's see. There we go. Is that the result of that pollination, that hand pollination, is that virtually 100% all of the plants, at least in my experience, that I've pollinated that way have set fruit, have produced a fruit. And this is just a little group of plants by the side of the road. And we're talking about these are now gone when they widened the road. These were on some land that some friends of ours had. And all of the plants that I hand pollinated produced fruits. And what I've done here is to simply show you, this was late June, a couple years ago. I harvested one of those fruit in mid-August. This would be considered a green mature fruit in orchid horticulture. Actually a good time to use those seeds if you're going to germinate them on artificial medium. And inside each of these fruits are tens of thousands of tiny, tiny, tiny seeds, so-called dust seeds. And this is not unique to orchids, but it's fairly odd strategy in higher plants to have such tiny seeds. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about those dust seeds, because it's a fascinating part of the life cycle, the life history of these plants, and is another whole sort of area of their biology. There's the whole pollination part, but this is sort of the seed biology. And so these are tiny seeds, less than 2 micrograms each. And I have a comparison, a lettuce seed, which gardeners here will know are pretty small. These are 500 times bigger than an orchid dust seed. And they have no endosperm. That's the starchy stuff that provisions a developing plant, an embryo. Their embryo itself is often just a couple of cells. So that's this tiny little dust seed over here. This is a nice bit of, when botanists used to be able to draw better than they can now. This is from 1946 paper by John J.T. Curtis, no relationship to me. I was a famous botanist at the University of Wisconsin quite a while ago. Really one of the originators of fire prairie ecology, but he also was fascinated by orchids. And that's the seed. It germinates in the soil, produces something we call a protocorm underground. And it can take 2 or 3 years for that little developing protocorm to actually push a leaf up above ground. So how's it been surviving all this time underground? Well, it turns out it requires a close association with a fungus. And so that's illustrated in this diagram, which I've taken from a paper by Hanne Rasmussen, who's one of the premier orchid biologists. She's in Denmark and has worked a lot on this problem of what the requirements are for orchid germination and recruitment into the next generation. And we require this tight relationship between the orchids and the fungus. The fungus is supplying carbon to the orchid because it has no endosperm. There's nothing there in the seed. It's now becoming clear that the orchids are actually parasitic on the fungus. The fungus gets nothing from the orchid. The orchid's pulling nutrients, carbon from the fungus. And it may shed that fungus when it's finally produces a leaf and it can do photosynthesis. So at least for those first couple of years in the ground, these little plants are what we call obligate mycoheterotrophs, or myco being fungus, heterotrophs like animals. They're heterotrophic. They are not autotrophic, like they don't do photosynthesis. But they start doing that once the leaf comes up. And they still are associated with fungi, but probably for different reasons, maybe other nutrients or disease interactions and other things that we don't fully understand. Lots of factors that go into the long odds for a lady slipper seed to actually make it emerge 2 or 3 or perhaps even more years later as a seedling that we finally see coming up above ground. So, whoa, really remarkable. But once you learn to recognize young plants, in many cases they'll just have a single small leaf. They're a little fuzzy. They can kind of look like a little Canada Mayflower leaf in the understory. they're actually maybe a little bit more common than you thought, and you start recognizing them. 2 leaves here, just a bunch of plants, none of them flowering. There's a flowering individual here, lots of non-flowering plants growing around it. And what we realize is that these large flowering individuals can be decades old, 20, 30, 40. It's not clear. They're really impossible to age specifically, but Professor Gill was following thousands and found almost no mortality. And he speculated that these big individuals are older than the trees that are growing around them. So they may be 50, 60, 70 years old, surrounded by trees that might be only 50 years old. So what was there before? It's an interesting question when we think of conservation of the species. So a note. So if you're thinking about, well, I'd like to have more lady slippers, maybe I can just transplant some. Don't try to do that. It's actually illegal if they're taking them from some place that's not your own land, but regardless, they virtually never survive this transplant shock. It's been tried, it doesn't work. They've got these stubby roots. In this case, I gently brushed away some soil to reveal the roots of this seedling, these stubby white roots and their associated fungi, they easily break off. And it's highly unlikely that you would put them in a micro environment that they would be happy in. So please don't do that. They really don't survive. You can hand pollinate and hope that the seeds work, but don't try to transplant seedlings. That won't work. So, so where do we expect to find lady slippers, and what's their niche? And we usually see them. Often it's the trail side. You might think, oh, they're just there. I happen to be on a trail. And I've just got some pictures of places that some of you are familiar with. Oh, and I've got a quote here from Doug Gill telling us a little bit about their requirements, at least as it's thought. The species is partial to acid, usually well-drained soils, such as sandy pinelands and dry woods on sandstone, but also in swamps and bogs. It doesn't sound like all that helpful. Acidity seems to be particularly key rather than drainage, but there are other factors as well. So there was, here's John B. Mountain. There's a really nice little stand of about 10 flowers. They're more vegetative. I checked just recently, none of those set fruit, which was not surprising. Here's a sort of a population that was growing on the edge of Coastal Road in Brooksville. There were about 100 flowers there a couple of years ago, about 10 fruits, so maybe 10% fruit set. I'd say half of those flowers, those plants got wiped out when they widened the road. So that, you know, sort of tells us something about the precariousness of some of the populations. But a population that I think exemplifies their native habitat, if you will, not trails and roads, but canopy gaps, openings in the canopy. And this was a particular, this is the biggest population I've ever seen. It's out on Cape Rozier on, can't divulge where it is, in a canopy gap. Hundreds of plants. I stopped counting at 300 flowers, many, many fruits, highly successful in terms of their reproduction. And what are the characteristics that allow these plants to do so well in this environment, or in any really? So I'm speculating here, but the ideal habitat, sunny. They clearly do. They don't do well in deep understory, deep shade, although they can persist there. So keep in mind they can live a long time. They just don't flower very often, and they're probably never going to be pollinated. Not too much competition, so not being overgrown by a lot of stuff. And you can see here, there's some bracken fern and some scattered blueberry and huckleberry, but not that much. And important, if you're thinking about reproduction, the pollination, is that there are pollinators around. And these bumblebees are ground nesting bees, and they like sandy, sunny substrates. Again, not likely to be found in deep forest interiors. So this might be the ideal habitat, a nice canopy gap that's opened up for any of a number of reasons, being maintained for some reason, fire, we'll talk about that in a second, tree falls, wind throws, that sort of thing that will open up a canopy gap. And these plants can just be waiting for that to happen. They live a long time. So that's that. And I have to mention what I think of as my champion lady slipper bunch. They're probably related to each other. This was a clump in that same population. I'm saying note the sun, it's nice and sunny. There are these surrounding huckleberries and blueberries. The bees, those bumblebees, will be visiting them and gaining a reward, and they may just decide, oh, I'm going to check out this lady slipper. This particular clump, I counted 19 individual plants, 17 of them were in flower, so almost 100% of them flowering, and I counted 4 that had been naturally pollinated, so that's almost 25% fruit set. And I could see from previous year's fruits, and even before that, that this clump usually produces about 3 or 4 fruits per year. So consistently about 25% fruit set, which is pretty remarkable. And if you look down at the base, you'll see all the old flowering stems. So clearly these plants flower every year and they're producing pretty well. So for me, as an ecologist, this sort of indicates ideal habitat for lady slippers for looking around, at least in coastal Maine. I'm sure they do well in other places in addition, but this would exemplify a very successful population in our area. So let's see, where are we? Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. I think I'll have some time for questions. So thinking about conservation in the pink lady slipper orchids, and I have to say we're fortunate. This is one of the species of orchids, and this is certainly not true with all of the slipper orchids, that's considered secure. That's its official sort of designation, globally secure. It's common throughout much of its range. It's got a broad range. However, and this is a quote from the North American Orchid Conservation Center, based out of the Smithsonian, that it does, however, exhibit persistently low reproductive rates caused in part by erratic flowering and infrequent pollination for the reasons that we've just been going over. So I think it's clear that these pink lady slippers don't reproduce well in forest interiors in a closed canopy of mature forests, and that both flowering and pollination increase in canopy gaps or following some moderate disturbance to the canopy, like that gypsy moth outbreak. The plants defoliated maybe for a couple of years, increasing light environment, and they recover. Or maybe there was a tree fall or a natural death of a tree in the canopy, and that opens up. However, we're also living in forests, and this is true throughout New England, that are maturing, and so we're losing some of these gap habitats, these edge habitats. And so thinking about, one of the things that we need to think about in our management of forests is the disturbance regime. And we heard a really nice talk last week on using fire to maintain certain kinds of habitats in Maine and other places. It's true anywhere, really. But also thinking about how we approach tree fall gaps, how we harvest trees, perhaps encouraging smaller and more dynamic patches, gaps in the forest. And so as we think about the particular requirements of pink lady slippers, thinking about how we manage these disturbances to create these gaps may be necessary to preserve a suitable habitat for the reproduction of the species. So with that, let me just say one last thing. Orchids have lots of fans, and that's great for orchids. Lots of outlets for orchids enthusiasts. Of course, there's an American Orchid Society that's quite large. I've used materials from the Native Orchid Conference. I do publications. I've listed their websites here. I mentioned the North American Orchid Conservation Center, which was started by an old colleague of mine, Denny Wiggum. Many local places. I mean, we have the American Orchid Society. I just picked one. Amherst Orchid Society, other small regional orchid societies all over the country, and even specific groups of orchids have their own societies, or in this case, there's an alliance just for the slipper orchids, and the list goes on and on and on. So lots of outlets, lots to learn. They're a great group of plants, and I'll just stop there and open it up for questions. And maybe I can.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. I learned so much.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. So we have, should I stop sharing my screen, or just we can hold it like this?
Whatever you want to do, I think. We do have some questions rolling in, and maybe Jake and I will bounce back and forth and ask them as they come in. And again, if you'd like to ask Peter a question yourself, you can raise your little blue hand that's at the black bar at the bottom of your screen. But I guess to get us started, we have a question from Donna, and she's wondering if she should use a leaf blower to remove the leaves from the area where the slippers are, and if so, when?
Not if they're covering up the leaves of the orchid, those big strap leaves, they're fine. And in fact, it might be good for the plant in terms of holding moisture around the plant. So if it's really covering up the plants, you can just brush it away. But unless it's actually shading and really covering up the leaves, it's not necessary. In any case, if it was covering over the plant and really shading it, that's not going to be good for the photosynthesis in that plant. You could take it off any old time. Something I didn't mention, but really interesting and poorly understood, these plants can disappear. They can go subterraneous, go underground for years at a time. There can be a perfectly good-sized plant, and Doug Gill documented this, and you come back later and it'll be gone. You think, well, it got eaten, it disappeared, and then 2 years later it'll come back up again. So it had been living underground with a fungus for years and then pops back up again. Crazy. Anyway, so keep them from being covered over by leaves, but if they're not being covered, I would leave the leaves there.
Great, Peter. We had another question from Jake. Is it only bumblebees that act as pollinators for the lady slippers?
That's a really good question, and the answer appears to be yes. The reason, they may not be the only thing that actually visits and gets trapped in the flowers, but the orchid scientists and taxonomists have made measurements really carefully between the various groups that crawl and the size of the bees. And so what they found is that our native bumblebees, genus Bombus, many of them, so it's not specific, it doesn't have to just be one, but that basic body size is just the right size for it to be able to get underneath the anthers, pick up the polinium, and then put it back where it belongs on the stigma of another plant. So the size relations are really quite important. And so people certainly look at who's a efficient pollinator and who might just be either sampling nectar if it's providing a reward, or in the case of a lady slipper, just bumbling around inside the flower and not really doing much. So bumblebees seem to be, and it can be, I think, a number of different species can be the right ones. I don't think honeybees have ever been shown to be effective pollinators. The thing is, very few people have actually seen this happen. I've never seen a video. I'm bound and determined to get one year. Generally what's happened is you catch the bees and somebody will notice that there's a polinium on its back. That's as close as we get to actually seeing this in action. I don't know anybody, somebody here may have actually seen this, but I don't know anybody who has. And none of the researchers I know have actually seen it. They've looked, they've sat around and waited. And pollination biologists do this a lot. They sit around and wait for the pollinators to come. And as far as I know, it's very rare. I haven't seen it. You find the pollen on the bees, that's easier.
Interesting. Thank you, Peter. We have a lot of questions rolling in, so we'll get through as many as we can, and then maybe we'll take a break for a minute from the chat box, and we have a couple people I think who have raised their hand as well. And then again, Peter's email was at the beginning of this presentation, so if you want to email him your questions if we don't get to all of them, and I will also, in a follow-up email, send you out his email again. So a question from Sandra: the flowers in the pictures are quite clumped. Is there any evidence for alternative reproduction such as rhizomatous spread?
Great question. Do lady slippers reproduce vegetatively? Generally, the ones here are in a big clump. And what I've read, and I haven't excavated these, so I have no direct knowledge of this, is that occasionally people have seen branching in the corms of the rhizomes, which they reproduce from, they arise from every spring. So they die back into an underground rhizome or underground stem. And people have seen that branch, and so two different plants connected below ground. So it is possible, what I've read. Apparently it's quite rare. So now this particular clump, this would be a likely example. Maybe some of these are actually connected, or more likely, I think, is that they're sibs. In other words, that they're related by the parent, that the pollen was falling down, and this is just a really good spot. All the fungi are there, and they are growing up together. So you see them in both conditions. Often what we see along trails is an individual flowering, another individual, and so forth. So it is possible, but rare. for that vegetative reproduction.
Thanks, Peter. That was a really good question too. So we have another question from Kathy here, and it says, what determines the number of flowers on a given plant? Does each plant only have one flower?
Just one.
Just one, okay.
Only ever one. Single flower, single floral primordium. So it's only just one. Sometimes with these clumps, it'll look like more than one. And other slipper orchids will produce more than one per plant, but the pink lady slipper is just one.
Nice.
Now, little sidebar, for those who are really into this kind of thing, you might know that plants can be self-compatible or self-incompatible. You know, they require crossing. Lady slippers are actually self-compatible. So if you pollinate the same one, use its same pollen, highly unlikely in nature, it will actually set fruit. And Professor Gill looked at the fitness, the viability of those seeds, and they appeared to be just as good as outcrossed seeds. But normally, the whole point of this is all to get outcrossing to happen, as Darwin pointed out.
Awesome. So we have a question from Sheila about yellow lady slippers. How common are they in Maine, and are they found all across Maine or in a particular part of Maine? And then she mentioned that she saw some several decades ago in Elliotsville Plantation.
Wow. Well, you know, I'm sorry, I really can't answer your question. They're not particularly common. I would just have to direct you to my favorite website for all things botanical, which is Go Botany. And it's the Native Plant Society. Somebody will correct me on this. They'll have distribution maps, and we'll give you a much better idea of how common that is, or one of the native orchids, or one of the orchid societies. I'd love to see more of them, but it's a different species, and nowhere nearly as common as the pink lady slipper.
All right. Lander, do we have anyone raising their hands at the moment?
We do. Cheryl has her hand raised.
Should we just do a couple of those and then see how much time we've got?
Sounds good. I think we have one right now, it looks like.
Okay.
Actually, hang on, she might have just disappeared.
Well, that's all right. Here.
So I'm not seeing Cheryl anymore, but I do see Nancy. So maybe I'll unmute Nancy if you meant to raise your hand. I know sometimes it's an accident, but I will allow you to talk.
Hey, Nancy.
And Nancy, I think if you unmute yourself on your end, you should, yeah, there you go.
I had written a question in because I've been watching a certain area for 20 years, and it doesn't have very many plants. And I can gather from what you've said today that maybe it's getting too forested around it because it's not very open, and there aren't any other plants, I think, that would attract pollinators. But this one or two plants that we've been watching, last year I was watching it and it was almost ready to bloom. I didn't really know anything about pollination, but when we came to see it, it had been bitten, the leaves had been completely bitten off, and the bloom was just lying on the ground. And we looked it up on the computer and found that it was probably deer. And so this year I marked it with a little marker so I could find it this year, and because I'd been recording it for 20 years.
Wow.
And there were a couple of other plants there, but trees had fallen, and this was the only one I really knew. And so this year we think we saw the leaves, but we weren't 100% sure, because there were a lot of those other little plants that you mentioned.
Mayflower, yeah. Canada Mayflower. They look a lot like though.
You think this plant will ever revive itself?
Well, it might. And your experience is very similar to my own. I've been following plants, and I'll get all excited, and then they'll be chomped off. And deer, as far as I can tell, deer seem to go right for my orchids. It drives me nuts. And they'll chew off the leaves, sometimes leave the flower. Sometimes they appear to just nip off the flower. I'm thinking of resorting to little cages around my orchids. I have so few that are flowering, and then I hand pollinate them. But this is sort of where we get into the question of what do you do? I mean, these plants are long lived, as I said, so they'll outlive us, they might live another 50 years, in which case, maybe there's a blowdown and it opens up or something happens. Alternatively, if it's your own land and you're thinking about managing for gaps, it's certainly possible to go in and either cut some trees out, to open up, to create a canopy gap.
Mm-hmm.
And there's other reasons why this might actually be beneficial for a forest. It mimics kind of the natural moderate disturbance that is typical in mesic forests like ours. We don't usually have big fires, but we do have insect outbreaks and ice storms and things like that typically open up the canopy. And that's for a variety of reasons, we argue that's a healthier canopy. So you could do the same thing on a small scale. And truth be told, I've done that as well. I'm trying to open up the canopy in areas which is closing in, and that's not a good sign for at least flowering in these orchids. So, if I see one growing underneath a little spruce tree on my land, I can cut the spruce tree out. I've got plenty of those, not enough orchids. So, and that would help. That would increase the likelihood it would flower. The other thing is that you have those one or two flowers, almost impossible that they're going to get pollinated. But if you do the pollination yourself, all you need is 2 plants, and then at least they'll be distributing seeds. So that's the only way in the end, you're going to get more plants, is if there's more seeds out there.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
But I applaud your 20-year effort. That's what, if you're working with these orchids, especially from seed, it's a legacy we're going to leave to our children and grandchildren and everything. They're the ones that are going to have to keep up with this, because it takes a long time for anything to happen with these guys.
They're so special.
They certainly are.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. So we have another hand raised. Looks like Kathy has a question. So Kathy, I'm going to unmute you from my end, and then you can unmute yourself.
Hi, Peter. My question is, if each orchid only produces 1 flower, if you have a large plant with only 2 flowers, does that mean it is several plants together?
Yes, there's got to be more than 2 leaves. There would be 4 leaves. So for every 2 leaves, unless something has eaten them.
Okay, no, I have a really large, it looks like 1 plant, but I'm gathering that it's many plants, but there are only 2 flowers.
So there's 2 flowers, but a bunch of leaves?
Yeah.
Would be
at least 20.
Yes. So that's just 2 individuals have flowered.
That's 10 plants.
Yep, and lots of different plants. So each plant only produces 2 leaves.
Okay.
And so you can count. What I did with that big bunch is I just counted every leaf pair, and they join at the base. You can.
All right. So if I hand pollinate, I will be outcrossing.
You will. That's right.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So just all you need is 2. And
all right.
In point of fact, if you just had 1, you could self-pollinate it, and it would still produce seeds and a fruit and a seed. But it's better to outcross if you can.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Peter. What do you think, Jake? Should we do another question?
Yeah.
Or I am aware that we're a few minutes over time.
I'm going to jump ahead because there was an interesting question that is actually a mutual question of mine. Let's see. It came from, let's see. Ooh, I lost my place, unfortunately. Well, somebody had asked if it's useful to plant like mutual pollinators nearby lady slippers to aid in attracting bumblebees, and if there's a particular species that pairs well with the lady slippers.
Well, in my experience, blueberries or huckleberry would be great. And I've been amazed. We found some growing basically in blueberry barren, and with much higher fruit set than I would have expected. And I think it's really because they're flowering about the same time as our blueberries, right? So there's late May, early June is when the lady slippers are really first come out. And the thinking is that you've got to get it then. That's when the bees are naive and they're hungry. The queens are out there. They're queen bumblebees. They're foraging. They need to provision their nests for their brood. And so they're really looking for stuff. And so we think most of that pollination happens fairly early, coincident with those blueberries and huckleberry flowering. So I would say just regular wild, Maine wild blueberries, low bush blueberries would be a fine companion plant, or other things that would attract bumblebees. But blueberries definitely do that, and they're important, as you know, in our blueberry culture to have. Honeybees can do that as well. I mean, they can pollinate blueberries, but bumblebees are the native pollinators for blueberries as well.
Great, thanks, Peter. I would not have thought of that. And to extend just quickly beyond that, if blueberries, Maine blueberries are slightly specific about where they will grow successfully, I think. Is there like a super common one that you would just off the top of your head suggest for the bumblebees as opposed to the?
Yeah, I'm trying to think now, actually, because it's such an early, I'd have to think about that. Let me contemplate that, and I'll talk to some of my horticulturist friends about what you might plant alongside. Whether or not something like starflower, which is also co-occurring, I'm not sure who pollinates those, whether bumblebees are doing that, or go further out into bumblebee habitat, which is typically sunnier, drier areas, what you might get in addition to those heath plants like blueberries and huckleberries out there. I'd have to think about that, but a good question as you're thinking about encouraging those pollinators. Absolutely. Yeah. Or just, in general, I mean, be good bee plants, but the trick is having them be more or less in the same place and flowering in that late May, early June in our area time period, so that they're overlapping with the orchids. Even though the flowers will last until now, but the thinking is most of the potential pollinators, all the bees have learned not to visit them at that point. They're like, nothing, you're not going to gain anything in there. It's just a big hassle. You get trapped, don't mess with them anymore. Go to something else that's going to provide a reward.
Thank you, Peter. Lander, do you want to maybe ask just one more question and we'll call it good for the afternoon?
Sure, that sounds good. I've just been kind of going down the line, and William's question is up next. Are lady slippers usually found on a certain side of a hill, as in northeast or south?
That's an interesting question. Not that I know of. I've been looking really carefully. They like those edges, right? I mean, you almost never, unless you see a canopy gap, like this one here on Cape Rozier, it's remarkable how often, even an old road or an old trail, where I have one of my populations, which is struggling, is on the old town road, which is it's completely abandoned road. But once it was open, and again, keeping in mind these plants are long-lived, so I suspect they were doing much better 30 years ago than they are now. Now they're kind of on their way out, and I'm trying to sort of revive them. So if they're on the sunny side of the road, that would be more likely. But in walking down Coastal Road, we've noticed them on both sides of the road. Problem when it gets too sunny is that there's often a lot of competition. So there's a mix there. So in other words, the shrubs are much higher, and they'll tend to if it's wet enough, they'll tend to overshadow the orchids, and that'll suppress their growth as well. So you look at an example like this where it's sunny, but it's maybe dry enough or something else, it's ledgy enough that there's not a lot of overgrowing of these plants from something else, but they're not entirely on their own, right? There are bee plants nearby that will bring in the pollinators. So, but that's a good question as we think about where would we expect to find them, and where might we try to encourage their growth by pollinating plants and so forth, or perhaps even distributing seeds, but that's a really long shot. Again, you're really in it for the long haul if you're trying to work from seed just randomly. Keep in mind that they have these very specific requirements for fungi to get going, not just like putting a seed in the ground and having it grow.
Well, thank you, Peter. We do have more questions, but we might pause here, and if you want Peter to answer your question, you can email him. Thank you so much, Peter, for offering that. And thank you so much for joining us today. It was a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate all the interest and the opportunity, and have a great rest of your day. And thanks again. And please do just pop me an email, and I'll try to get to those as we go along. So see you, everybody.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Good night.